Welcome to a special edition of the Daily Tea called Investigates, episodes where we do a deep dive into one of the major stories we at The Telegraph have been looking at. I'm Kamal Ahmed. In August of this year, you may remember that here on the Daily Tea, we did an episode on the sinking of the Bayesian, a yacht owned by British billionaire Mike Lynch. After months of work by our senior reporter, Henry Bodkin, this episode is about what might have caused a boat that was once described as unsinkable to vanish beneath the waves that day. It is a remarkable piece of work from the heart of our newsroom, bringing together many of the mysterious threads of this tragic story.
A mother cries for help as she fights to keep her baby's head above the waves, but in the pitch black, all she can hear are the screams of others.
In the face of death and in the face of life, there is no difference between rich and poor, or between nobles and commoners. The word that the mother and all the injured kept repeating was darkness, the darkness that they experienced during the shipwreck.
A red flare arcs into the night above a sea that is now eerily quiet. Sometime later, a handheld torch moves faintly in the distance. Both are spotted by the crew of a chartered diving ship moored nearby, an old converted tugboat from East Germany. Rattled but intact, they have spent much of the last hour staring in disbelief as, illuminated by intermittent lightning, a vessel infinitely more advanced than their own is enveloped in a violent storm. By the time that storm has eased, the boat has disappeared altogether.
One man has died and 6 others, including 4 British tourists, are missing after a yacht capsized and sank in an early morning storm.
As the sun rises, loved ones in at least 3 countries are about to receive news that will shatter their worlds. Across Europe, reporters and TV crews are racing to the nearest airport. Meanwhile, an industry sustained by unimaginable wealth, but sensitive to the glare of outside scrutiny, gears up to defend itself. In hospital, experienced mariners sit dazed and battered, trying to process what just happened.
The UK Marine Accident Investigation Branch is sending a team to Sicily to help the local authorities.
The more savvy among them will know that they are about to be visited by a different kind of storm, driven by a single word: how. Welcome to the Daily Tea Investigates, the Bayesian yacht sinking, with me, Henry Bodkin.
Could you test your mic for me and just say a few words?
Testing, 1, 2, 1, 2. As you've just heard me say, I'm Henry Bodkin, and as a senior reporter, I'm often asked to look into complex stories that require a fair amount of digging. What it doesn't always involve is learning how to use a microphone. You can hear me speaking to Louisa, one of the producers on the Daily Tea. She's doing her best to guide me through this podcast business.
Some people prefer standing, so if you feel the need.
No,
you all right?
Do you want me to, or...?
No, I think you sound fine. It's just if you're a fidgeter, I might ask you to later.
The date was August the 18th, 2024, a Sunday. The location, roughly half a mile off the fishing village of Porticello on the North Sicilian coast. A luxury sailing yacht, the Bayesian, was anchored. The ship was 56 metres long and cost around £30 million. There were 12 passengers on board, plus a crew of 10 to look after them and operate the vessel. Legally, the boat belonged to Angela Beccaris, the wife of Mike Lynch, Britain's first technology billionaire.
Well, I was originally an academic, working in the engineering department here at Cambridge, and I had no knowledge of business or business background, and we made some sort of breakthroughs in getting computers to understand what things actually meant. And rather naively, I sort of thought, you might be able to make a business out of that.
So Mike Lynch was born in the East End of London to Irish parents and raised in Essex, and he was a gifted computer scientist. He'd made a fortune several times over from the 90s onwards by using statistical theory to design highly sought-after search tools.
That literally sounds like gobbledygook to me. I don't really understand what that means in any way. But if you're saying he's sort of made billions, I'm picturing a sort of British Bill Gates.
Yeah, he was actually referred to by some as the British Bill Gates, and he's been referred to as Britain's first technology billionaire. He was certainly a leading force in the development of what we call Silicon Fen, that cluster of high-tech businesses centred around Cambridge. And autonomy, which provided pattern recognition software, that was his crowning success. As CEO, he led its charge into the top 100 public companies in the UK, and when he sold it to the US giant Hewlett-Packard in 2011, it's estimated that he personally netted a cool $800 million.
Wow, all right for some. I suppose these days, when I think of a sort of tech billionaire, I'm picturing Elon Musk and sort of Elon Musk levels of antics. Is that what Mike Lynch was like?
Absolutely not. No, I mean, he did name his conference rooms after Bond villains, and he did drive an Aston Martin. But actually, I think you can chalk that up as just childish indulgences. He was actually very understated in his style. He soberly dressed. He looked a bit like a church warden. Certainly wasn't a Californian tech bro style at all. And in fact, from talking to people, I get the sense that he never actually lost wholly that air of computer geekdom that was ultimately the foundation of his vast success. He seemed to be completely devoted to his wife and 2 daughters, Esme and Hannah. Hannah had a place waiting for her to read English literature at Oxford. She was with her parents as Bayesian anchored that night off Porticello.
And this wasn't a usual summer holiday, even in billionaires' terms, was it?
Absolutely not, no. It was a massive celebration. Lynch was starting, in his words, a second life last summer, having recently emerged from an ordeal that could very well have ended his life as he knew it. So shortly after the 2011 autonomy deal I was telling Louisa about there, Hewlett-Packard cried foul, claiming that the company was far less valuable than they had been led to believe. They went on to accuse Mike and others of artificially inflating the firm's revenues and profits in order to increase its value at sale. In 2018, US prosecutors agreed, indicting him and the former autonomy vice president Stephen Chamberlain for fraud. There was a lengthy and bruising extradition battle.
The British software tycoon behind Autonomy will wake up in detention in California today. He's facing 17 charges related to the sale of the company to Hewlett-Packard. He's been fighting extradition to the United States since 2019, and in December he told us what he thinks is wrong with the current extradition agreement with the US.
If the US requests an extradition of any British citizen in the UK, they don't need to have had any connection with America. They are basically default extradited.
Ministers came out and made claims of American overreach.
I mean, if you were a young software writer or a biochemist with a new drug or a new treatment or whatever, and you built a company out of it, the last place now you're going to launch your company is on the London Stock Exchange. Because if an American buyer comes along, and that's the most likely buyer in a high-tech company, if an American buyer comes along and buys it, you're liable for the next 10 years suddenly to find yourself facing possible extradition and facing trial in America because they don't like the deal. They've got buyer's remorse. That's exactly what happened with Hewlett-Packard.
But ultimately, in May 2023, Lynch was flown to California under the guard of US Marshals and confined to house arrest ahead of trial. If found guilty, he faced 25 years in jail.
You basically go around saying goodbye to everything. You have to put all of your affairs in order. For me, being a great dog lover, actually saying goodbye to the dogs is a major thing. And, you try and make sure that you've left everything for your family in a way that can operate for them. And it was very stark the way it happened, in that I had to deal, because I was on bail, with the UK police, who'd always been perfectly civil, decent people. And they rang me up and said, would you like us to pick you up round the corner so that, family don't have to see it? And they put me in the car and they apologised for it being so early and drove me off to Heathrow. And whilst we're still on British soil, they hand me over to the Americans, who immediately put chains around me.
Handcuffs or chains? Or
chains around my waist and my legs and my handcuffs. And I'm standing there, and I'm thinking, where am I going to go when this plane is at 30,000 feet?
Here he is speaking to the BBC's Evan Davies on Radio 4 in his only broadcast interview after the ordeal. Only 0.5% of federal cases result in an acquittal. But despite this, Mike managed it.
What matters in life for anyone is their family and their health. And, that's whether you have a large amount of money or you don't, is always the same for everyone. And, there have been positives to this journey, and that I've been fortunate to, meet some wonderful new people, and I have new friends and things like that. But the one thing that the reason I'm sitting here, let's be honest, is not only because, coming back to what I was saying, I was ultra innocent, and perhaps have had experience of handling complex situations because of what I do, but because I had enough money to not be swept away by the process that's set up to sweep you away. And that's wrong. That is wrong.
On June the 6th this year, after 12 weeks at trial, he was acquitted of all charges.
So what did Mike do next?
Well, the first thing he did was come home. He returned home full of plans to help those less wealthy than himself, particularly those who have been prosecuted in America, and to carve out a meaningful next chapter of his life. But the immediate priority was to celebrate with his family and to thank those instrumental to his success.
And so who was that? Who was on the Bayesian to celebrate with him?
On board that night were friends and advisors of Mike's, and lawyers who helped him with his case and their partners. This included one of Mike's colleagues at his venture capital firm, Charlotte, her husband and their 1-year-old daughter.
So it was a freedom party, basically?
It was exactly a freedom party, and Bayesian was the perfect venue. I'll try to paint you a picture of this amazing yacht. Bayesian had extensive teak decks, part of them sunken, and sweeping saloon windows. The exterior styling had won a prize at the World Superyacht Awards in 2009, and in 2020 the interior had been lavishly refitted in a Japanese fashion. Its six staterooms were the last word in seaborne luxury. But arguably Bayesian's most distinctive feature was her single 72-metre mast, the second highest in the world. It gave the yacht an elegant simplicity, and Lynch and his family simply adored it. Facing ruination in the States, the tycoon had put Bayesian up for sale in March, but swiftly took it off the market upon his acquittal. Among the ranks of the classiest billionaires, owning a sailing superyacht is increasingly fashionable. Just ask the likes of Jeff Bezos, Diane von Furstenberg and King Mohammed VI of Morocco. But not only do they require more maintenance than motor yachts, they're also more expensive and require a highly qualified crew. Having worked at sea since he was a teenager, James Cutfield, Bayesian's 51-year-old New Zealander skipper, fitted the bill. As the guests settled in for an evening celebrating their host's remarkable reprieve, these senior sailors were almost certainly aware of the stormy weather forecast for the wider region that night. It could well be the reason the skipper decided to drop anchor off Porticello, where the bay is protected from the open sea to the north and west. As the sun went down, they might also have noticed that the local fishermen were staying in port. What happened between then and sunrise the following day may never fully be understood. It certainly hasn't been yet. One thing that definitely seems to be adding to confusion in reporting is the habit among elements of the Italian media, although it's quite widespread, of taking second or even third-hand survivor accounts and then presenting them in direct quotes.
Okay, I'm a bit confused by that. Can you explain what you mean?
So, for example, Italian reporters would speak to a doctor or a lawyer who may have spoken to one of the survivors.
Okay.
They would then get an account from them, a rough account of what that survivor had said, but then they would write it up in direct quotes.
Oh, okay, I see. That would definitely cause confusion because you'll think you're hearing from the witnesses themselves.
It absolutely did. It gave the appearance in those frantic days after the sinking that those at the heart of the mystery were willing to talk when in fact they were anything but. Regardless, a patchy yet reasonably coherent picture of the disaster has emerged. One of the essential witnesses is Borner.
Can you explain who Borner is?
Sure. So Carsten Borner is a sort of Captain Birdseye figure, if you watch the news reports, and he was watching from the deck of his boat, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, as Bayesian came into the cove and dropped anchor at about 9:35 that night. At 11 p.m, he took a final look at Bayesian's towering, illuminated mast before turning in for some sleep. By 3 a.m, he was on deck again. He was preparing to transfer some passengers ashore for an early flight, but as the wind picked up, he abandoned that idea. Instead, he ordered the crew to prepare his boat, the Sir Robert Baden-Powell, for rough weather, shutting windows and skylights, starting the engine to manoeuvre away from a side-on wind.
We noticed weather coming, and when it appeared, we started our engine to keep the ship in position, and we had the other yacht behind us. And a moment later, she was gone, and we couldn't declare what happened.
We know all this because Borner spoke directly to several media outlets.
So we've heard from Borner who could see the Bayesian, but what about anybody on board the boat itself?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. The most illuminating evidence we have from on board so far is that of 22-year-old British crew member Matthew Griffiths. However, his story was briefed to Italian journalists by local prosecutors, an authority, incidentally, that would go on to formally investigate the sailor. Various quotes have been published that are attributed to him, but they seem a bit odd.
What do you mean by a bit odd? Summarised in the way that you were talking about earlier?
I think so. They're unlikely to have been Griffiths' actual words, I think. The gist is that Griffiths woke his captain once the wind reached 20 knots. Cutfield, that's the captain, then told him to wake the rest of the crew. We don't know exactly when this took place. What we do know from Bayesian's data transmitter is that at 3:51 a.m. the vessel started to drift violently, roughly 80 metres in one direction and then 80 metres back in the other. Maritime experts have suggested this indicates Bayesian was still at anchor and was being dragged on its chain by a changing wind. Now that's a perilous scenario for any ship. However, this hasn't been confirmed, nor whether Bayesian's engines were ever started.
Okay, well that's interesting because Borner has said that he started the engines of the Baden-Powell because they were concerned about conditions.
Yes, that's considered quite a standard response to rough weather, is to pull the anchor up and get manoeuvrability on your vessels to avoid it being hit by the wind side on. Now, at some point, Mike and his wife Angela were woken up in their cabin, and that's according to a doctor who spoke to La Repubblica, an Italian newspaper.
So these second-hand reports again.
Yes, although in this case they did acknowledge that it came via a doctor, so that's a bit better. The doctor said Angela had been frightened by the sound of broken glass and rushed on deck to see what was happening, cutting her feet in the process. Mike stayed below. Golunsky, the 36-year-old mother, was already on deck, it was reported elsewhere, having chosen to sleep there with her baby.
And so what's the time now at this point?
So this is in the run-up to 4 a.m. The wind and the rain was barrelling both down and horizontally with such voluminous force that the crew of the nearby Sir Robert Baden-Powell have said they were finding it difficult to breathe. What is now reasonably clear, and this probably accounts for Borner and his shipmates' disbelief, is that in the minutes leading up to 4:06 a.m, when Bayesian's location signal cut out, the storm did something unusual. It seemed to focus its violence in a spitefully localised manner, right on top of the superyacht. Matthew Griffiths, the 22-year-old crew member I mentioned earlier, was reported as saying the vessel tilted, throwing those on deck into the water. Tilted. Is this the moment Bayesian capsized? It appears so. A producer is reading the words Matthew is quoted as saying.
We were walking on the walls. We somehow got back on the bridge and tried to make a human chain to rescue those who could get to the opening from the accommodation deck. They were walking up the walls because the boat was lying in the water. The first one in the chain was the captain who reached down. He helped everybody, the women, the mum with the little girl. But we were sinking, and unfortunately, some didn't make it.
Now we have the picture of a massive vessel on its side, probably in near total darkness, and a horrified crew aware that numerous guests remain below decks. Those still in bed when the great yacht went over will have woken to a nightmarishly disorientating situation. It is not yet known whether anyone who was on the lower deck when the boat capsized got out in the short amount of time before it sank. Then, just as the storm arrived, it left.
After the storm was over, we noticed that the ship behind us was gone. And then we saw a red flare.
A red flare from Bayesian's life raft prompted Borner to dispatch a tender from Sir Robert Baden-Powell. As they motored away from their ship, cushions and other flotsam surrounded them in the water. Then they saw the flashing torch.
So my first mate and I went to the position, and we found this life raft drifting with 15 people inside.
15 people
15 people inside. 4 people injured, 3 heavy injured.
15 people, some of them injured and bandaged, all in a state of shock. I was the captain of this, said one. Another said the boat had sank in 2 minutes.
And in the life raft was also a little baby. So it was a big disaster. We brought them to our ship, and then we communicated with the Coast Guard.
As they transferred the survivors into the tender, a woman pleaded with Borner not to return to his ship so that they might continue to search for the others. Later, as she sat wrapped in blankets on Sir Robert Baden-Powell's deck, Borner asked her if she was okay. It turned out to be Angela Beccaris. Her husband Mike Lynch and daughter Hannah were among the 7 people missing. No, she replied, I'm not okay at all. So how does a super yacht sink? Well, if your name is Giovanni Costantino, founder and CEO of the Italian Sea Group, which owns the company that built Bayesian, then the answer is simple. It was the crew's fault.
Una notizia che mi ha reso
The animated voice you can hear is that of Giovanni Costantino. He's the CEO of the Italian Sea Group, and this is him speaking to Sky News on the 22nd of August, just 2 days after Bayesian sank. Before the final body had even been recovered, the one-time furniture mogul turned nautical supremo had begun a series of public statements expressing incredulity that the disaster could have been the result of anything but the grossest incompetence. I don't know how many of you speak Italian, but to summarise, he's saying that Perenni Navi ships are unsinkable, the safest in the world. The boat suffered a series of indescribable, unreasonable errors, he said. He questions why the crew were not in a state of alert, given the storm warnings. He points to the fishermen. If they could take the hint, why not Bayesian? Why, he asks, had all the passengers not been woken and assembled in the main lounge? And perhaps most damningly, he says a hatch in the hull must have been left open. Otherwise, he says, Bayesian cannot sink. As he speaks, rescue divers were working around the clock to access the stricken vessel under the gaze of the international press. Hope swirled that those missing might have found an air pocket, that there might still be time. But for the men of the Italian Navy's specialist unit, it was painstaking, hazardous work. Operating in pairs, they had just 20 minutes oxygen for each dive. They were forced to move slowly to avoid worsening the already poor visibility by disturbing sediment. Eventually, one tragic discovery after another was made. Bodies carefully recovered. On the surface, Sicilian officials were briefing journalists off the record, but mistakenly giving out the wrong names. Investigators announced they were considering potential crimes, namely shipwreck and manslaughter. By the end of August, the captain, the chief engineer, and Griffiths, that 22-year-old crew member, had all been placed under formal investigation. Now, under the Italian legal system, this does not imply guilt, and it does not necessarily mean charges will be brought. 4,000 miles away, however, among a somewhat different type of maritime community, it set alarm bells ringing.
Well, I'm Cape Cod, Massachusetts, which explains the sailing background. But after college, I worked for newspapers for 20 years, and I was actually editor of the statewide Sunday newspaper in New Hampshire. But at some point, I ran away on my sailboat to the Caribbean, and I don't know, I guess ran out of steam there and came back and started working for boating magazines, like, for example, our yachting magazine.
Robert Swanson is a journalist of the old school and a sailing nut.
And when I got out of the magazines altogether, I reintroduced Loose Cannon, and it's going along just swimmingly.
Loose Cannon is Robert's newsletter on Substack, which aims to publish stories, in his words, the boating public cannot find elsewhere. Now, on August the 30th, he had an exclusive. Robert had got his hands on a document which, although rather boring on the face of it, would cause consternation in sections of the boat-building world and blow the debate over how Bayesian sank wide open.
Well, I didn't actually find it. I'll explain to you how it landed in my lap. You know, I'm in tune, obviously, with, the naval architects and people like that. So when the Bayesian, capsized and sank, everyone was wondering how it happened. And then shortly thereafter, somebody in the marine industry over there in Europe, in the mega yacht industry, the guys, and I will say it's a guy, I'll go that far. The guy sends me a chart that I believe it was the chart that showed the flooding characteristics of the vessel. And I got this thing and I'm looking at it and said, this is pretty cool, but there's nothing in this chart that indicates it's Bayesian. So I get back to him, I typed and I said, look, that's great, but that could be any boat. There's nothing on it that identifies. Next thing you know, I had the whole stability report and a few other pertinent documents in my inbox.
A vessel's stability booklet is a sort of operating manual for the captain or master, but it doesn't describe how to switch on the engine or dim the lights. It is far more fundamental than that. Across 89 pages of mostly tables and graphs, Bayesian's booklet set out the physical limits to which the vessel could be subjected before certain quite important things started happening.
I've got a big story, and I didn't do anything. It landed in my lap, and the motivation of the guy who leaked it, he's probably a friend of the captain of Bayesian. I don't know. But nobody had any faith in the Italian justice system not completely screwing the captain and crew.
Right.
Yeah, and so, the feeling was that the booklet would illuminate the design characteristics that might have contributed to this and perhaps put some brake on the Italian process of investigation, or at least, cause a little pause before they completely blame the captain and the crew for everything. And I think that was his motivation. And why he picked me, the loose cannon brand is, I brand it as something that's apart from the normal boating press, which it would be unkind to say that it's based on a form of commercial prostitution.
Right.
But to a large degree it is. And there's little faith that, they would publish anything that would be derogatory toward a company like Perini Navi,
right,
which is, prestigious yacht builder. And so he probably felt that it was safe to give it to me, then it would get, it would get the treatment it deserves rather than having a bunch of people hemming and hawing with their publisher and ad department about, what to do with this thing or whether to do anything with it. He knew I would just publish it.
Among the fraternity of naval architects and other maritime professionals who make up much of Loose Cannon's readership, two things in the booklet stood out. One was what is known as the angle of vanishing stability. Simply put, that is the angle of heel, lean or tilt to you and me, at which a vessel may capsize rather than naturally righting itself. The other was the down-flooding angle. That's the angle of heel at which water might begin entering the vessel. Robert Swanson and his friends were astounded, because for Bayesian, both metrics, but particularly the down-flooding angle, seemed surprisingly low for a sailing vessel. Why was the down-flooding angle so low? The answer, a number of experts have argued, is to be found in Bayesian's standout feature, its mast. Here's Robert again.
I mean, when these sister ships of Bayesian were built, they were a catch. They had two masts.
Yeah. As Robert says, Perini Navi, the yacht builders, built a series of vessels similar to Bayesian, but Bayesian was the only one in that sequence built with one mast, not two. This was at the request of the original owner, who wanted a statement, a single focal point of towering elegance for his boat. Perini Navi's answer was 72 metres of aluminium, the tallest mast of its type in the world and the second tallest overall. It was extremely heavy.
And so when they decided to modify this one in such a way that there'd only be one mast, it changes the weight distribution.
This creates a relatively high centre of gravity, which has to be counterbalanced.
And that required that they add weight, ballast is what it's called, in a place where it's not usually added. And so now you've got this mast that's heavy forward, and then you've got ballast. And that lowered where the vents were still in the same position, that supply air to the engine room because diesels need air to operate. So that actually made those vents closer to the waterline, which, put the boat more in jeopardy in the case of when it's heeling over.
In short, the combined weight meant Bayesian sat low in the water, pushing its vent openings in the hull close to sea level, even before any heeling took place. None of this, however, explains what caused the yacht to heel so dramatically in the first place. Here, we must return to the confusing sight confronting Borner and his crew aboard Sir Robert Baden-Powell in the minutes approaching 4 a.m. on August the 19th. That shroud of furious rain engulfing their close neighbour. The storm within a storm.
Now we were hit by a violent gust yesterday, a tornado, water tornado, I think.
So, Henry, what is a downburst?
So, in the week after the sinking, Italian authorities said they believed the culprit to be a downburst or a microburst. This is a meteorological phenomenon.
So let's talk about how this process works for a microburst. Well, of course, in a thunderstorm, you get updrafts. So once that air starts to rise, it starts to condense. You get what's called condensation. It cools. Sometimes you get rain droplets forming. And then some of these raindrops will fall to the ground. Others will evaporate. And when evaporation occurs, that's when the atmosphere starts to cool. All that cool air drops like a rock right into the ground. And then you get these winds spreading out everywhere. Another way you can think of this is in terms of density, a little density lesson. When you throw a heavy rock into the water, it sinks. And that's kind of a similar concept to this.
The air can hit the ground or sea at 100 miles an hour or more, tornado speed, before barreling outwards horizontally. Often they last only a handful of minutes. Obviously, all sailors understand that violent winds can be dangerous.
Of course.
But Bayesian's sails were down, and so this is arguably the most contentious question of the whole mystery, and it's one that's being staunchly resisted by the manufacturer. Even without sails, could that massive, eye-catching mast have generated enough surface area, along with the rest of the vessel above the waterline, for the gale to have leaned the yacht to its down-flooding angle? Guillermo Gafael, a Spanish naval architect and consultant, believes so. Here's Robert Swanson again, the writer of Loose Cannon Sailing blog.
There's something in boats called windage. Now, a sail is designed to capture wind and propel a boat, but all the structure of the boat above the waterline is windage. It's subject to the elements. So Guillermo, he, with a computer modeling, he calculated the windage for not just the mast, but there's something on the mast called spreaders, which are a structural member, like a cross member that connects cable from the deck all the way to the top of the mast and makes it strong. And on a boat with that massive mast like that, these things are very big as well. And for each of the 6 pairs of these, and Guillermo calculated the effect of the wind on each one of them, which I guess has never been done before because there had never been a reason to do it before. And he basically came up with, it was the mast all along. The Bayesian, after 73 degrees or whatever, was not coming back.
Guillermo concluded that a gust of around 60 knots or more might have been enough to push Bayesian to an angle whereby water would begin flooding in through the vents.
The mast was too high. It was that was the original sin of this disaster, the sin of arrogance, pride, however you want to put it.
The Italian Sea Group strongly disagrees with this.
What do you think about the attitude of the Italian Sea Group, which is the parent company of Perini Navi, who's the boatbuilder, and Giovanni Costantino essentially blamed the crew while some of them were still in hospital, said it must have been their fault. We now see that they've sued the New York Times for a piece that they ran recently, which was partly based on your endeavours and those of the experts that we've been talking about. What do you think of the attitude of that company?
I don't think the New York Times is worried about that at all. And I think that almost the unanimous verdict is that this Italian Sea Group character is a big asshole.
Right. So that's it's good to hear a clear view.
That's a very diplomatic response to Robert from you there, Henry.
Yes, to be honest, I wasn't quite sure how to handle that. Anyway, the Italian Sea Group, though, are still refuting these findings.
So I'm sensing that we have a long legal response incoming. What have they said to you regarding Robert's reporting and yours too?
Well, in short, the firm denies any structural weakness in Bayesian's design and stresses that the yacht complied with MCA stability criteria, that's Britain's Marine and Coast Guard Agency. The company has also stated that a 60-knot crosswind on the night would have heeled the vessel to just 18 degrees, so that's before the downflooding angle. They say, and therefore, in adequate conditions, cannot lead to the immersion of any downflooding point. It said, at 80 knots of wind, the heel angle would have been 28 degrees, so that's also before the downflooding angle on Bayesian. The Italian Sea Group also said that vents in the hull were, and I quote, in any case protected by remotely controlled watertight closures. They told us, as repeated several times by all the experts, that's the sinking, happened because a massive quantity of water entered, close quotes. They also said, with reference to the issue of the angles and inclinations of the ship, I do not believe that any newspaper is responsible for technically establishing what happened.
It's rather rudely diminished all your work there, Henry.
I think that may have been slightly in response to a New York Times article, but I think they would direct that at us as well, yes. So much remains unknown. There are multiple investigations, the Italian judicial proceedings and a probe by the UK's Marine Accident Investigation Branch, which dispatched 4 experts to Sicily in the days after the sinking. In Ipswich, near the Lynch's Suffolk home, inquests have been opened into his and Hannah's deaths. Mike's cause of death has been given as drowning, but in the case of Hannah, his talented daughter who loved Shelley, the romantic poet who died at sea, the investigation continues. The inquest will formally resume on April the 15th. They are unlikely to piece together definitively what took place below decks in those dark, disorientating minutes before and after the vessel sunk. Hannah, we know, died alone in her cabin. Concealed between 2 floating mattresses, her body was the last the divers found. 5 others, including her father, the only billionaire ever to have been killed on his yacht, were discovered together in a separate compartment. There is a far greater chance of eventually understanding what took place above deck. Okay, so above deck, there are certain elements that seem likely to prove important in getting answers. One of them would be the evidence of the surviving guests, and of course that will include Angela, Mike's wife. Her evidence, when it comes, could prove critical, both because we think she was on deck at a relatively early stage,
and presumably because of what she will say about how the crew reacted at the time?
Exactly. Her testimony will carry huge moral weight. In the meantime, though, she inherits the financial horror of her husband's legal row with Hewlett-Packard, with the company confirming after the sinking that it would continue to pursue civil damages of up to $4 billion.
And on that, I do feel like we have to get into some of the theories that have been swirling around since the yacht sinking.
I guess we should. Yes, Mike's wealth, his improbable victory over powerful forces in the US, has unleashed a storm of speculation online. He had reported connections to MI5 and America's National Security Agency through the software he sold them, and perhaps the most tantalising example for such people was the sudden death of Lynch's co-defendant Stephen Chamberlain.
Cambridgeshire Police put out an appeal for witnesses or any dashcam footage after a man in his 50s, they said, was taken to hospital with serious injuries following a road accident. It has now emerged that that man is Stephen Chamberlain, the co-defendant to Mike Lynch in that fraud and conspiracy trial in the US. It happened just a few days before Mr. Lynch went missing.
Now that's clear evidence of a conspiracy, they say, without explaining how anyone could coordinate a hit on a quiet country lane with a surprise storm 1,500 miles away.
Yeah, that feels unlikely to me, but maybe that's just me. And what about the crew? Have we heard from them at all?
No. Bayesian skipper James Cutfield has returned to his home in Mallorca, where supporters launched a fundraising drive. But in common with his colleagues, he remained silent. Some continue to question why the crew did not react differently, why in the 15-plus minutes between Bayesian starting to blow side to side and the location beacon being lost, they couldn't have made the vessel fast, weighed anchor, used the engines to point into the wind, if indeed they didn't.
So that leads us to the question of the weather.
Remember earlier when I spoke about the phenomenon called downbursts?
My name is Jan Miles. I'm one of a couple of captains for the Pride of Baltimore II. She follows behind the first Pride of Baltimore.
Now, Jan is a man who understands all too well the horrifying power of a downburst. In 1986, he lost 4 friends when the Pride of Baltimore, a replica schooner, think of Cutty Sark or something similar, sank. It was that event where Jan lost friends and colleagues that first alerted people to the dangers of microbursts at sea.
So going to the business of a microburst didn't come out until later in the inquest. And this is when National Weather Service said, there's a thing out there that's called a microburst. We've known about them for quite some time from the 1970s out west. Back then, there was no internet. There was no direct access to this stuff. They had gone back based on what they'd read in the papers that was essentially, in science terms, ground truth evidence by the descriptions of their survivors to the clue that maybe there was something going on in the air that they ought to look at. They found through their satellite, they saw clues that they had found relative to describing and creating the concept of what is a microburst, where a cloud form is falling and pancaking out on the surface.
That's a fantastic scientific or quasi-scientific description of the phenomenon. But could you describe from a sailor's point of view, well, I mean, you did speak to the survivors, what's it actually like to be on deck and to be in the middle of one of these things? What did they say it was like?
The way the crew describe it is there was this sudden clarity of mist to the windward. And it was like a wall of water, as they described it. And the next thing they knew, the boat was horizontal with masts in the water. When I say next, it's probably a 30-second period of time whereby you see it. The captain is deciding to try to bear away to be in front of it. The boat does a steady leaning over, doesn't hesitate part way, but just keeps going over and over and over, and then goes flat in the water. And with all that kinetic energy, and she went down vertically after that. And so the crew were then scrambling to get to the life rafts. Again, the tempest was still going on to some degree. So we're talking 2 minutes between the actual kinetic energy impact of the wind and the disappearance of the vessel.
The question is essentially, could it have been better designed, or actually, frankly, are there just some moments in nature which are so violent that you can't blame the boat design, you can't blame the crew, it's just what it is?
Well, let's start with the crew. The Pride of Baltimore scenario happened in less than 120 seconds, and the boat was gone.
Jan cautioned against second-guessing. From talking to the survivors of his boat, he says the initial phase of such an event is, he says, like that of a major earthquake, prompting an unavoidable moment of confusion and inaction.
Is the crew at fault? What did they tip the boat over, or did the wind tip the boat over? So this idea that the crew, in the context of the moment of impact and the motion that it created, the description of the Bayesian is that they started to respond to the 20 knots of wind. They were clearing up the deck. They were witnessing roughly 20 degrees, and then they got thrown in the water. And then later on, we read that there was some climbing back aboard after the thrown in the water bit. So that time difference between 20 degrees and climbing back aboard, how long was that? We don't know. But they weren't standing there twiddling their thumbs in the meanwhile. They were responding all the time.
Sudden downbursts, the potential for unforecast tornado-strength wind arriving from multiple directions, have been known about for decades. They are rare, yet they have been implicated in numerous air disasters and at least one sinking of a major sailing ship. They are made more likely by a warmed-up surface, and the Mediterranean has never been warmer. Should the mega-yacht industry have these more in mind before designers put pen to paper? Jan puts it this way.
We've got to understand that weather phenomenon has the ability of being so concentrated and so narrow-banded and so completely focused that you could be in exactly the wrong place at exactly the right time in a very, very handsome sail vessel that does a lot very well and then get knocked flat in the water.
There will likely always be those who point to the fact that all but one of the crew survived, yet nearly half of the guests perished. But before joining them, it is worth trying to put ourselves in the skipper Cutfield's shoes in that moment, trying to understand the baffling power of the weather he would have been summoning his guests up into, appreciating how absurdly distant the notion would have been to him that his huge yacht with no sails up could have been blown over, if indeed it was. Italian justice moves slowly, but it has also been known to play up to the media in high-profile cases, villainising individuals before they step foot in court. In this case, however, observers have noted that the prosecutor's office has not, on the whole, been briefing against the crew, as their counterparts did in the cases of Amanda Knox or, for that matter, the master of the doomed Costa Concordia cruise liner. Perhaps it bodes well for their chances of a fair hearing, if it ever comes to that. Plans to raise the wreck inch forward. It will be delicate, expensive work, likely to involve an attempt to rotate the boat nearly 90 degrees without disturbing the 18,000-odd litres of fuel still on board or dismantling that massive mast. But it conjures a ghostly image, Bayesian sitting upright on the seabed with 22 metres, roughly the height of a 7-storey building, of its defining feature, that towering mast protruding out of the water.